So we should picture the crowd, a crowd of Jewish listeners. Then this teacher begins to say, but when the Son of Man comes, you can kind of almost see them turning and looking and saying, now you're talking about something I'm interested in. Now I'm going to pay attention. They skipped over the teaching about the kingdom. Then he's giving the judgment for the people who didn't listen to the teaching about the kingdom. This is the stuff they want to hear. They were having their ears tickle. The stuff they want to hear. They were editing out the stuff they didn't like. In other words, all the context they didn't like. Do not be like them. Listen to the stuff even if you don't seem to like it. Even if it doesn't seem interesting. Because sometimes that's where the important parts are. For example, as I've been going through this stuff so far, I've gone through 2 pages of notes. Now, I know you were listening because you are a great congregation and you listen to everything, right?
Right.
Okay. But had you not listened, you would have skipped over the important part of the sermon. All this stuff is to illustrate the stuff I said before. So as we're going through this, it's all to illustrate all the types of context I've already told you about. And they were doing the same thing. Don't be like them. Now at the time when he's coming, the stuff he's describing in this passage, he's going to have the nations before him. This is certainly an end times prophecy. Because the nations weren't gathered before him right then and there. It's all Jewish people right before him. That is not the nations. That is one nation. That is not all the nations. So this is clearly an end time teaching, set amid a Jewish kingdom teaching. So he's talking about the kingdom, then he's going to talk about at the end when he comes back to rule his kingdom. This is not about salvation for the Christian. You know, we have a tendency, a lot of medieval interpreters, what they would do is they'd always have like 4 interpretations of a passage. They had the literal interpretation, they had the moral interpretation, they had the prophetic interpretation, and the interpretation for the church. Okay? So they'd have 4 different interpretations for the same passage. What a lot of evangelicals or people of our look to is they go for the one for the church. And I've heard endless passages about this, about feeding the poor. It is not about feeding the poor. It is not for something for us to do because we're going to not be here when this passage matters. Does that mean we shouldn't feed the poor? No. We have other passages that tell us to feed the poor. But this one is not about that. What is it about then? It is set in a literal Jewish kingdom, speaking to living people. It is not about salvation for the Christian. There are also no dead in this passage. It doesn't say that there's any dead there. It doesn't say the dead nations. It says the nations. The implication is they're still alive. These are living people standing before the Messiah. Living people. People who are alive. About to go into the kingdom. Now, what we can learn from this, at the time of his coming, he will have all the nations gathered before him. This is clearly an end times passage. Set amid a Jewish kingdom. Now, many have tried to use this as a proof text about salvation. Clearly, the historical context of when this was spoken denies this sort of teaching. He's not speaking about believers. He's not speaking about the church. He's not talking about how the church give food to the poor or help the sick or whatever. Now, the church is supposed to do that. Other passages say to do that, but this passage is not about that. There's no church there. Instead, it's about a Jewish kingdom. And the king of that Jewish kingdom dividing the nations while they are alive. It is the Messiah doing this when he comes in his glory. So the conclusions we can draw about this first part are he's going to come back and rule a Jewish kingdom. And he's going to divide the nations based on something we haven't gotten to yet. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat, and I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." So, the Messianic kingdom is inviting people in, the Messianic king is inviting people into his kingdom. It is based on what they did. He tells them that their works are what gets them into the kingdom, because they did certain things for him. Now, obviously, this raises a question for us. How are we going to do that? We're not over 2 times the age of Methuselah, okay? So, which is what we'd have to be to have actually done something for him. So this is certainly not speaking about him personally. And the people there had the same natural question. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when do we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when do we see you a stranger and invite you in, naked and clothe you? When do we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent you did it to the least one of these brothers of mine, even to the least of them, you did it to me. These are natural questions for the crowd has. I mean, for this group of people asked, because this is not the people gathered there. Remember we talked about that? This is an end times prophecy. They'd have to be more than 2 times the age of Methuselah to have done it for him. He says it's not to him personally, but to his brothers. Now, there are 3 possibilities for brothers. They could mean his physical brothers, or Jesus and Mary's other children. He could mean the church, or he could mean the nation of Israel. The first possibility. Jesus did have step-siblings. Joseph and Mary did have other children. We know that because the scripture says they had other children. Remember when it says his brothers and sisters came to him? Okay, they had other children. They were step-brothers and sisters. Now, they've only been dead slightly less long than he is, by comparison to the amount of time. So you'd still have to be over 2 times the age of Methuselah to have done something for them. So you'd have to be pretty old to have done something for one of his step-brothers and children. So he certainly did not mean that. The second possibility. This is the one most often applied to this, the most often misinterpretation. Since Jesus had not died and been resurrected at this point, he could not say these brothers of mine because there were none of the church there. The church did not exist until about 40 days after Jesus was resurrected. So it cannot possibly mean them. Again, using the history of the statement to understand to who it's directed. This is certainly not directed to the church, since these brothers of mine indicates that those were standing right there with him. And none of the church was standing there with him, because he was still there and hadn't died and been resurrected yet. Now the third possibility, he means the nation of Israel. Now, this is where knowing that it was before 70 AD is going to help us. Now, they were going to be scattered after 70 AD. So, the apostles, or the people he's writing to are Jews in Israel. We know that because of all the Old Testament references. We know that because Matthew was the apostle, we know historically the apostle to the Jewish people, and he's writing, and the entire book has a very Jewish flavor to it. He's clearly writing to the Jews. This will also help us with the word brother. Now, brother in Greek can mean 2 things. It's the Greek word adelphos, which could mean physical brother, like my physical sister, my physical brother. It could also mean spiritual brother, and it's used both ways in the New Testament. But again, this was before the resurrection, so there would be no spiritual brothers. None at all. It would be unnatural to imply that meaning from that word. The more natural reading is physical brother. Now, Jews often use that term to refer to their physical brothers, even after the resurrection. Both Peter and Paul, after the resurrection, when they're speaking to Jews, refer to them by this word, their brothers. Moreover, they do it to unsaved Jewish people. They refer to them as their brothers. Now, Jesus is speaking to a primarily Jewish audience. Matthew is writing to a primarily Jewish people. This makes spiritual brother a very unnatural interpretation. The better hermeneutic is to assume that the word means physical brother. Jesus is speaking about a judgment based on how you treated the nation of Israel.